Hey there, what's up everybody, Indro here, and today I'll show you how to animate in Photoshop. This is our very first Photoshop animation video, and today we'll be creating this bouncy ball animation. At first we'll be creating the basic motion, and then we'll add realism by adding spin and squeeze to the bounce, and we'll finish things off by adding a realistic shadow. As always, you can download the PSD that we'll be creating right now. You can find the download link in the description sections below, and please don't forget to subscribe to support my channel. So let's get started right after the intro. Well, most of us use Photoshop for mainly photo editing purposes, but in terms of animation tools, Photoshop really packs a punch. And for intros and sting kind of animations, I really use Photoshop a lot. I guess you'll be also surprised to know that the intro that you saw right now is also created in Photoshop. Let me know in the comment section below if you want to see a tutorial how I created that intro. Well, if you use Premiere Pro and After Effects, this might not be the best video for you, but I guess you can still stay along, grab a cup of coffee and enjoy. So let's get started by creating our blank canvas. Let's keep our height and width to 800 by 800 pixels. And the resolution of 72 pixels per inch will be just fine. Like with any video animation, you need the video timeline. So bring up your timeline by going to Window, Timeline. And here you have two options to create a frame animation or a video timeline. Frame animation is the old school process, like adding each and every detail frame by frame, and it's a very tedious process. I won't be covering that in this video. So let's go ahead and create a video timeline like we do in Premiere Pro. Okay, so since this is the first video, I'll covering few of the basic stuffs over here that comes up in this timeline window. So Photoshop by default creates a video timeline of 5 seconds and it's 30 FPS. You can change the frame per second by going and opening this flyout menu, and you can click this set timeline frame rate and you can see that it's 30 frames per second. So that means in 1 second there will be 30 frames. Right, so you can change it from here to anything that you like, but let's keep it to 30 for now. You can drag this slider to zoom in and out of your timeline. And here, as you can see, Photoshop by default created a 5-second timeline, right? So here are the seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So F here signifies a full span of a second. So that's why you see here 1F, 2F, and the others here 10F, 20F, these are the frames. So like here from the timeline 0, the time starts, you traverse 10 frames, 20 frames, and here is a 30 frame, a full 1 second. So this is how it happens over here. So if you ever try to find the midpoint, you have to, for 30 frames, the midpoint is 15 frames. So this is the midpoint of 1 second timeline. Okay, so with that done, let me show you how it works. So let's create a new layer and let me add a square, a simple square, and let me fill it with black and let me deselect it. Okay, so if you drag your timeline like this and you create a new layer, you saw what happened. The layer just appeared in the timeline at the moment where the timeline marker was. So definitely, to make things start from the very start, you have to drag it and match it to the very beginning of the timeline. But you can also like drag it all the way here, or you can click this button which says go to the first frame, and once you create any new layers over here, you will see that it's always starting from the 0 point. So let's delete this unnecessary layer, and over here I'll show you different options just as we expand this layer in the timeline. You can see by default Photoshop gives us 3 keyframe animations. One is position, second is opacity, and third is style. So for position, obviously you know this will record any position change that we do on this layer. So let's see an example. So once we click on this stopwatch, you will see that Photoshop places a marker. So Photoshop says that whatever you are doing now with the position, I'm watching, I'm recording everything. So I'm taking my move tool, I'm dragging the slider to maybe somewhere around here, 4 seconds, just this is random. And now the move tool, if I drag this object over here and just as I release my mouse, you will see Photoshop places one keyframe. So it's kind of like Photoshop said, I knew what you did, I knew what you moved that black box, and so I marked it over there in the position timeline. Now, if you just drag your timeline, you see what's happening? It's just moving. Photoshop is animating it. It's just moving from where it was at the 0th of a second to where it is the last point where you have dragged it. You can simply click this play button and it's a simple animation that we did right now. Isn't that easy? Great. Now I'll also show you the opacity animation over here. Let me stop this for a moment and go back to the very first frame. Let me add an opacity keyframe. So here Photoshop is now again saying, whatever you do the opacity, I'm watching, I'll record everything. So here my opacity is 100%. So I'll go to this keyframe. I can simply drag it and place it, and I might not be perfect and precise with placing it just right on top of the keyframe. So what I can do is I can select this position timeline. I can click this small arrow and it will just go to the next keyframe, which is the keyframe marked at the 4-second timeline. So over here, I want the opacity to go at 0% so that it moves and it fades out. So I'll drag the opacity all the way to 0, and as you can see, Photoshop placed the opacity keyframe over there. So let's grab our timeline to the very beginning of the animation and let's play it. So as you can see, we have added 2 different animations over on top of this simple black box. One is the position movement, another is the opacity control. Isn't that cool? Great. Let's stop our animation here and I'll show you a simple variation that you can achieve by simply turning your layer into a smart object. So let's clear away our animation keyframes, and you can simply do that by clicking on this stopwatch, and you can see that the keyframes are now gone. So the opacity stays at 28% because at this point the opacity was going down from 100 to 0 and it landed up at 28% at this very point. So I'll just crank it all the way up to 100%. Okay, now let me show you what differences you can get if you turn this layer into a smart object. I'm just right clicking and converting it into a smart object. And now if you expand this layer in this timeline, you will see that the position is gone, but you have transform. And you know what you can do with transform? Pretty much anything that you can do with the transform tool. So let's add some spice to what we have done earlier. Let's go back to the very first starting point of the keyframe. Let's start our stopwatch. Photoshop places our keyframe. Let me select the move tool and drag it all the way to here. And let me grab the timeline marker and take it all the way maybe to 3 seconds. And now I'll bring up the free transform tool by hitting Ctrl or Command T on the keyboard. And now if you move it, this is also considered as a transformation, and Photoshop will place a keyframe over here. You saw it, and if we play it, it will move the object. And also what you can do is, let me go to that keyframe, and what you can do is you can do other transform operations. So again, let's bring up the free transform tool by hitting the Ctrl or Command plus T, and let's make this square smaller, maybe to around 10%, and let's commit the changes. And now if we play it, let's take the timeline to the very start, and now if we play it, you can see that it's also becoming small. Now that's interesting. Okay, let's stop our video and get rid of this black box, because who cares about a boring black box? Let's bring up a nice basketball. Okay, so it has some shadow to it, so let's get rid of that quickly. I'll simply bring up the free transform tool. I'll scale it down a bit. I'll rasterize the layer, and then I'll select the quick selection tool, quickly mark the ball, create a layer mask around it, and apply the layer mask to get rid of the shadow. Now as you can see, my timeline marker was at some position other than the starting of the timeline. The layer was placed over there. We can simply grab the layer and drag it all the way to the very beginning. Nice. So we'll be applying some transformation to these balls, so better we'll right click and convert to smart object. Now let's visualize the animation that we are trying to achieve. But before that, let's scale down the ball a bit so that it gets aligned with the animation that we are thinking about. I'm bringing up the free transform tool by hitting Ctrl or Command plus T, and then let's scale it down maybe to something like this. 25% is fine. I'll create a new layer. I'll take a brush and any color, and we will create the bounce along this line. The ball will appear from here, drop at the floor, and then go up right like this. So let's delete this layer. Okay, with the ball layer selected, let's expand this from the timeline window, and the ball will definitely bounce at the middle of the timeline. So it's 5 seconds, so the middle will be 2.5, but again it's 30 frames per second, so our middle will be 2 seconds and 15 frames. So we can expand this timeline to see the frames properly, and here is the 2-second marker and here is the 15 frame. So this should be our middle point. Let's click on the stopwatch to record the transformation keyframes, and let's take the move tool and drag the ball all the way to here. I'm just not placing it at the very bottom of the canvas because I want to show you the shadow afterwards. So let's keep it like there, or we can just take it a bit up. That should be fine. Now let's squeeze our timeline a bit, and let's go to the very beginning of the timeline. Now here we have thought about the ball to appear from here. So let's drag it and just keep it there. That's done. The marker is placed. Let's play our animation. Wow, the ball is appearing magically. Now let's also make it magically disappear from the canvas. To do that, let's grab the timeline and take it all the way to the very end. Grab our ball and throw it out of the canvas. Once you play it, you see the animation is happening. Isn't that easy? Okay, so one thing here, you see the animation is looping. You can achieve that by clicking this settings icon and select loop playback. If loop playback is not checked, once the animation is done, it will stop over there. So let's loop our playback. Okay, with that done, we'll add some realism to this bounce, because when a ball bounces, it spins and it also squeezes when it hits the floor, right? So let's try to add that effect over here also. So let's drag our timeline marker to all the way to the very start. Let's bring up our free transform tool, press Ctrl or Command T, and you see it's actually over here. The ball is out of the canvas. So I'll just rotate it. I'll simply punch in -90 degrees and commit the changes. And just as you drag it, you can see that the ball is spinning. What's happening is it's spinning from -90 degrees to 0 degrees. And we go to the very end of the animation, and I'll again bring up the free transform tool by hitting Ctrl and Command T. And this time I'll enter +90 degrees and I'll commit the changes, and just as we played, you can see that the ball is slowly spinning as it's hitting the ground. Great, now let's add a squeeze to the ball. Let's go to the center point of our animation, the middle keyframe. Just click this button to go to the center keyframe. Simply bring up the free transform tool by hitting Ctrl or Command plus T, and let's squeeze the ball. Make sure your maintain aspect ratio button is not checked, and we have squeezed it like this. So once it gets squeezed, it also expands by the sides. So let's expand it a bit. Great. Now I'll commit the changes and play the animation to see what we have screwed up. Yeah, we have screwed up. As you can see, the ball is getting squeezed just as it's appearing in the animation, because we have told Photoshop like that. Obviously, we have asked Photoshop, hey Photoshop, squeeze it when it's at the center point and keep it at the perfect shape when it's coming in for the animation and it's going out. So Photoshop is slowly also animating that information over here. So we need to correct that, right? So let's stop the animation. I'll undo the changes and I'll zoom in a bit so that we can get hold of the frames properly. So this is our center middle point frame, right? The 15th frame after 2 seconds. So I'll just go one frame before and I'll add a keyframe over here. So what will happen now is when we'll be applying the squeeze effect at this center keyframe, it will only start getting affected when the animation is going from this 14 frame to 15 frames. Because we have asked Photoshop to keep the position, keep the transformation intact by adding this marker. We'll do the same when the ball leaves after hitting the ground at this frame number 16. We'll add this keyframe by clicking this button. And then let's go to the middle frame, and this time let's add the squeeze and see what happens. Bring up the free transform tool by hitting Ctrl or Command plus T, and let's squeeze it and expand a bit and commit the changes. And now let's play it. So you saw that the squeeze is happening perfectly when it hits the ground, but it's a bit fast and it's choppy. So let's smoothen things out. Let's stop it and go to our middle frame. Perfect. So I'll also add another keyframe before this one at the 13th frame and one at this 17F. What I'm trying to achieve is I'm focusing on this keyframe, which is in between the center where the impact happens and at this point where the ball lives. So I'll also add a squeeze, a little bit of squeeze, not the amount that we added for the actual impact, and we'll add a small amount of squeeze and that will help smoothen things out. So let's bring up our free transform tool. So let's squeeze it a bit, not very much. Yeah, 20% should be good. And let's also expand it. Yeah, 27% should be good. Or let's take it up to 28%. And this should be 20%. Let's come with the changes. Let's remember the numbers. And let's do the same at this number 14 frame to keep things symmetrical. Let's bring up our free transform tool. And the height was 20%. And the width was 28%. So let's commit the changes and play our animation and see what we have got right now. So as you can see, it feels a lot smoother, right? That's great. So let's pause the animation. Let's squeeze our timeline and I'll show you one cool trick. So if you think that the animation is kind of slow, this 5-second loop is really slow, makes the ball look really slow in the animation, we can also speed things up. We can pause the animation, we can take this work area slider, we can drag it all the way, maybe to 3 seconds. And so the animation will now only loop within this 3 seconds, but we need to fix the keyframes, right? So half of 3 seconds is 1.5 and that is 1 second and 15 frames. You can drag hold of all the keyframes like this, left clicking and dragging over the keyframes. You see they are highlighted and drag them to that point. I think they are at the center point. Also, we need to fix the finishing keyframe, drag it and take it all the way to the 3-second ending marker. And now once we play it, you can see that the animation is a lot faster. Also, you can increase the frame rate. It was 30 FPS like we have seen earlier. Simply go to this flyout menu and click this set timeline frame rate and you can change the frame rate to maybe 60 FPS and click OK. And now you can see that the middle point has actually changed. It's now 30F, obviously because initially the full 1 second had 30 frames, so the middle point was 15 frame marker, but now it's 30F as we have 60 frames in 1 second. Great. Now let's play it, and 60 frame animation should be a lot smoother than the 30 frame animation. Let's finish things up by adding a realistic shadow. Let's create a new layer below this ball layer. I'm just holding the control on the keyboard and clicking this new layer icon to create a layer below the ball. Let's rename it as shadow. Let's drag the layer to all the way to the start of the timeline. Let's take our timeline marker to the middle point of the animation where the ball hits the ground. And make sure you are selecting the shadow layer and let's add a shadow. I'm simply selecting the elliptical marquee tool. I'm holding Alt or Option on the keyboard and I'm simply dragging to create an elliptical selection. I'll center it and I'll select color black from here and I'll hit Alt and backspace to fill it. I'll right click and deselect. Let's feather it out. Let's add a soft blur. Go to filter, blur and Gaussian blur. Let's blur it to around 8 pixels and the opacity is fine. Let's drag it a bit so that it matches with the ball. Yeah, that's fine. So what we'll do with the shadow is, as the ball moves, the shadow should also move with the ball and it becomes fainter as the ball leaves the ground, right? That's how shadows behave when some object is hitting the ground. The more closer you are to the ground, the shadow is more darker, and the more far away you are from the ground, the shadow will become fainter. So for the shadow animation, we'll be using the transform keyframes and also the opacity keyframes. So let's convert it into a smart object. And also one more thing, just as the object goes further away from the ground, the shadow also seems to become smaller. So for that reason, we need to transform it, scale it down. And if that was not the case, we simply could have not turned it into a smart object and could have taken advantage of the position keyframes, right? Okay, so let's go back to the middle point of our animation. And over here, let's add a transform keyframe and also an opacity keyframe. The transform keyframe will say that this is the shadow that we want at this place when the ball hits the ground, and the opacity should also be 100%, right? So let's go back to the very beginning when the ball is just coming into the canvas. Here I will get the move tool. I'll hold shift so that I can drag the shadow in a straight line, and I'll drag it out of the canvas just like that. So let's see what we have achieved over here. You see that the shadow is coming with the ball just as it hits the ground. Also, let's try squeezing the shadow a bit. So you cannot actually see it because it's out of the canvas. But yeah, let's bring up the free transform tool and simply squeeze the shadow by width. Let's take it to maybe 35% and hit OK. Now let's see what we have got. That looks realistic, right? So we'll also reduce down the opacity. Simply with the first keyframe selected, we'll reduce down the opacity all the way to 0, or maybe not 0, let's keep it to 10%. And now let's see what we have got. That's nice, right? Okay, let's replicate the same thing when the ball leaves the canvas. So let's go back to the very last keyframe. We can click this button over here to go back to the very last keyframe of this transform timeline. Over here, let's make sure you're selecting the shadow layer. Take your move tool, hold shift to move it in a straight line and take it all the way out of the canvas. Now let's squeeze it. Let's bring up our free transform tool and let's punch in 35% width because that's what we have done when the shadow is coming into the canvas. And also we have changed our opacity to 10%. Let's do that and let's see what we have got. That's nice, right? Let's play the animation and see. Okay, so this is how you can make animations in Photoshop. You can create cool animations for your Instagram videos, Instagram posts, and you can get creative. You can download the PSD, the whole PSD that we have created right now in the description section. You can download it, bring up your timelines menu, play it to have fun with it. And just to finish things up, let me save the video. We can pause it, we can go to File, Export, and we can go to Save for Web. And that will give us the options to save it as a GIF file or GIF file, how you want to say it. Also, we can save it as a video file. So we can go to File, Export, Render Video, and over here you can punch in any video format that you want. I'll keep it as MP4. Let's name it as animation. Make sure work area is selected. It will take in all the frames that is there in this animation, and let's hit render. And once the video is exported, let's see our animation. So here is our animation, and here you go. So I hope you like this video. Please let me know if you want me to make more animation tutorials in Photoshop, and do like, share and subscribe to support my channel. I'll see you in the next one, and till then, stay creative.